the last of our slides talking about moral development and specifically Kohlberg's model is looking at all the different stages. So here they've actually broken it down in a kind of unfortunate way, but we've been looking at our three different levels, acknowledging that there are two substages each within each of these levels. However, this study actually had that last level. They didn't break it down into two separate substages, which is why we've ended up with 1 through 5 instead of 1 through 6. But the first two being that first level we discussed, the second two being our second level, and then the last one being our third level. So close, but not quite the same as what we've been talking about. But what I care about here is actually our pattern of what individuals at which ages show which stages of moral development. And so we see that those early stages, the ones where you're mainly focused on environmental feedback and doing what will or won't get you into trouble, those ones die off fairly quickly. So we see that those are fairly high when you're children and they go away into adulthood, though there are some individuals who will persist having some of these moral stages even into their 20s and 30s. But then we also see that the next two stages are going to increase as we get a little bit older. So stage 3 gets fairly high when we're getting closer to adulthood, and then it sort of plateaus and tapers off, where stage 4 becomes the dominant and the most common of our moral stages into adulthood. And then interestingly, stage 5, that last level that we talked about, where we have people making up their own decisions, their own values based on their own experiences, that one only starts appearing into adulthood, but it never really gets as common as some of our other stages. So very few people end up progressing all the way to this stage. And that seems kind of counterintuitive because we've been looking at stages so far with that idea of individuals start at the beginning and travel through all of the stages in a predictable format. But for Kohlberg's theories, these were just meant to be sort of different categories. And yes, we do tend to see people progress through them in a similar order. However, we acknowledge that not everyone is going to move through all of these stages. Some individuals may stop at stage 3 or stage 4 and never actually progress to stage 5. It's just neat to see this pattern where we have sort of these different proportions of a population at different ages showing different prevalences of different stages here. But our next section is where we're going to get into some more of our physicality in terms of development. And specifically, we're going to start off talking about our brains, where when we're born, our brains are only about 25% of what they will be when we're adults. And one of the reasons for this, we've mentioned before that head size is something that's constrained by evolution. Specifically, if our heads are too large, then birth mortality tends to go up. So in order to have maximum survival through that natural selection process, there's sort of a maximum head size that we can have for children leading to successful births. So their brains are smaller when they're born and then grow fairly rapidly once they're out of the womb. So by 6 months, they're actually 50% of their adult weight, and they're going to continue to grow and increase in weight. Now, we do know that there is still rapid growth, more and more cells being created, lots of neurogenesis, where we end up having sort of our peak amount of neurons and neural connections around that sort of 2 years of age mark. However, a lot of this growth is actually coming from the fact that our cells are becoming larger. So when we're born, cells have been dividing really, really rapidly in a short amount of time. So there hasn't been tons of time to have lots and lots of that intracellular fluid that's what fills all the gaps within our cells. So once we're born and have time to accumulate different resources, those cells can get bigger. So more surface area for the outside of the cells, more volume on the inside, they take up more space and gain more weight. And as this process goes on, as we have not only more neurons, but larger neurons, they're able to make more and more connections. So that's when we start seeing our neural networks forming as our brains are making these connections. And when we start looking at how those connections form, it matches up with a lot of the patterns we talked about when we were looking at prenatal development, where, again, we focus on things that are key to survival. So we start seeing lots of connections, lots of these interactions forming in and around, say, the brainstem. And eventually we move off into less important things for base survival, but still important for functioning. Things like those association or associative areas within our cortex, stuff that allows us to make connections, to pull information from multiple areas, things like that. So we start with biologically essential and progress towards those that are more useful but not necessary for survival. And once we get into sort of the 5 years of age range, our brains are up to 50% of adult size. So again, still very fast, though it slows after we get right out of birth. And as we get to this adult size, we're still seeing that maturation, still seeing more connections, and that progresses all the way until we're about 25, where we're finally coming into fully matured brains. And like I said, those association areas are the last to finalize. Specifically, we'll see that adults, the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brains right at the front that's responsible for personality and decision making and integrating information, that's the last one to finalize within our brains. But yeah, as this process goes on, we're seeing more connections, but also eventually less connections because we're able to prune extra or redundant connections once we figure out what we do and don't need. So we become more specialized because we've figured out what's essential and we've gotten rid of what is no longer essential. All right, so our next sequence here is looking at motor development. And these are, again, patterns that we're typically going to see. These are still arranged sort of step-like because these things progress earlier and these things come later. And for a lot of these, we have certain stages that are required. So things like being able to stand with support precedes standing alone, and you have to be able to stand in order to be able to walk. So those are sort of requirements that they progress in order, though there are always odd exceptions. So things like, so crawling would fall somewhere in here where you can sort of support yourself with your arms and you can start moving your legs to move across the floor before you start standing and walking. Though there are cases, I think one of my cousins skipped crawling, and so he rolled until he could walk and skipped over crawling entirely. So I always have students ask about exceptions, and there definitely are, but for the most part, we're going to see this kind of progression. And if you're wondering what these bars are, the early the start of the bar is where about 25% of children are capable of doing this action. So by 2 months, 25% of babies are able to support themselves with their arms. And by the time you hit 4 months, 90% of children can pass this skill. So that's what our sort of limits are here, is the 25% and 90%. And we see that range because there are definitely individual differences. So some children will physically develop faster than others and develop some of these motor skills sooner than others, and get to certain stages faster than others. But these show us those basic patterns. So most of these skills are following those stage-like sequences where we see that natural progression in a predictable way. The age of acquiring these skills definitely varies, hence the bars, and some of these have very large bars, but the sequence seems to be fairly consistent. We do end up with some oddities, and I think I've mentioned these before, and these are those U-shaped functions. So our U-shaped functions are the ones that they exist early on, then they go away for a time, and then they return later on. So the stepping reflex, where if you hold a baby up and give them that chance to step up to a surface, they do it shortly after birth, and then it goes away for a while, and then right around the time that they're ready to start walking, that stepping reflex returns again. We also mentioned that sound localization, turning to orient towards a sound, follows that same U-shaped function where it exists, then doesn't, and then comes back. So we have a couple of these where they have atypical patterns. And I think we've mentioned before that sometimes the theory being that that goes away because maybe that area of the brain is reorganizing or something's going on that prevents it from happening until certain changes have settled down. So that's possible to be one of our explanations there. If we wanted to introduce some environmental and cultural experiences or influences on some of these different stages and development processes, we can look at some of those physical components, things like your diet. So in order to continue growing and supporting multiple changes within our cells and those connections between cells, we definitely need to have all of those nutrients that are going to facilitate that growth. We also can see some patterns where things like being in more enriched environments, being in places with lots of stimuli, lots of sort of resources in terms of like experiences, that leads to having heavier brains, mainly because our density is increasing. We're making more connections. There's more matter crammed into that space because of all those experiences, because we form new connections as we encounter novel situations. We also see that things like physical touch can count as enrichment as part of our environment. And it's actually something that those who don't get to interact with others, we tend to see detriments in terms of their behavior in the long run. So physical touch can be really, really important. In terms of sensory components, we do find that certain lack of exposure can have long-term effects. One of the most famous studies is not in humans, but we can use the idea, but in cats. And what they've done is they've raised cats in environments that lack certain types of stimuli. So they had two groups, and some were raised in environments with vertical lines only, specifically set up so that it was a round room with vertical black and white lines painted on the walls, and even the floor. They didn't allow there to be a horizontal line to match where the sort of walls touch the floor. They inserted a mirror so it looked like those lines continued onward. And so they grew up in this environment with no horizontal lines at all. And then, once they were grown and developed and everything, they looked at their ability to discriminate between different horizontal stimuli, stuff they'd never seen before. And what they found was that the cats had actually lost the ability to perceive horizontal surfaces. So any of the neurons that would have specialized in interpreting horizontal lines instead of just vertical hadn't developed and therefore had been lost. And they did the opposite, only raised in horizontal environments with no verticals. Same thing, they lost their ability to perceive vertical. So deprivation, especially if it covers, say, a critical period, can end up causing permanent detriments in your ability to perceive. So kind of interesting, though, especially for humans where our brains are fairly plastic, at least until middle childhood, those deprivations would probably have to be for quite a long time. Because as we saw in those children who had cataracts and couldn't see at all until 6 months of age, they very rapidly caught up in terms of visual development right after that. So this would only hold if that deprivation lasts longer than that period of plasticity or flexibility within the brain. This slide is just meant to be sort of a overall interpretation or overall idea here. So our general principle saying that our biology sets limits, kind of like our reaction range theory, where we have, say, a range set by our genetics that says you will become, say, this height or that height, or somewhere in this possible range based on whatever genes you got from your parents. However, our environment is always going to play a role. So our environment can influence where we fall within that range, within those limits set by our biology, and we're then going to see where we fall based on those current experiences. So our environment can have a very powerful influence, especially if we look at things like lack of exposure to nutrients or resources or whatever. And we also need to keep in mind that these biological and environmental different factors end up overlapping pretty dramatically as well. So we can have our genes influence our environment, but we can also have our environment influence our genes. And for examples, our genes influencing our environment, if we looked at, say, a personality trait like extroversion, someone who is very extroverted might find themselves in more social situations. And then being in social situations, it's affecting our environment, could lead them to encounter, say, additional stressors. Maybe they're around a lot of people and they end up with a very negative self-image or something like that. Our environment, of course, can also activate or deactivate certain genes and a whole bunch of other ways of interaction. So just a few examples in case you're curious. Our next section, we're finally getting into adolescence, and then eventually we'll get into adulthood. But for adolescence here, we're specifying that this is a period that begins at puberty. And so at puberty, we're having a change in all of our sex hormones that are released. And those hormones are then going to cause changes within our physical bodies. So our brain's hypothalamus is going to signal our pituitary gland. And you might remember the pituitary gland is sort of like the control center for all of our endocrine system. And so we see an increase in secretions of hormones, and mainly those sex hormones. And as that process goes onward, we start seeing our secondary sex characteristics. So things like females developing breasts and starting to menstruate. For males, they're going to have changes in hair patterns of growth and muscles, and sperm production starts to occur. And for this process, we're talking about puberty as sort of this biological change, this biological process. We do make it clear that adolescence, though it starts at puberty, it isn't just puberty. Adolescence is specifically this transition between childhood and adulthood. And technically, if we look at that process, adolescence can change depending on the time period and the environment in which it occurs. And so in some cultures, they would look at childhood and transitioning directly into adulthood, basically saying that as soon as they are capable of reproduction, they should be counted as adults. And there might be rites of passage, certain ceremonies or events that mark that transition. But in other places, we have a much longer period of adolescence. So especially as we've had changes following the Industrial Revolution, that is tying into the fact that we need a longer period of change. And it started, I mentioned the Industrial Revolution because that was the tipping point where, yeah, they had children who were working in factories far younger than they should have been. But basically, as soon as you were big enough and strong enough to work in a factory or work in a certain environment, you were put to work. But as technology advanced, as things changed, we needed these longer and longer training periods. And specifically, we start seeing the requirement for additional schooling to get that training to then be effective in the workforce. So it became common to have this prolonged period where you're not quite children anymore, but you're not yet fully independent adults. And that transition period gets longer and longer. And to the point of nowadays where, especially if you take, say, multiple degrees in university, then it might not feel like you've started adulthood until you're capable of being on your own. And there are different defining factors that different cultures and individuals will use to decide that you've hit adulthood or not. Though legally, they'll set it as a certain age, usually the age of 18. But these are all products of society and all of those changes, so we can track it back to some of that history as per usual. But if we're seeing all of these different changes internally, we wouldn't be surprised that we're starting to see external changes as well. So a lot of our psychological changes come about because of all of those differences. So some of the psychological consequences that we can look at are things like mood and changes in behavior, where hormones can directly affect our mood because things are changing in terms of the patterns that our bodies are used to. But we can also look at mood affected by how others in our environment treat us. So when we look at sort of males versus females, with males, they typically end up coming into puberty and it tends to be a positive experience. And most research looks at those who hit puberty early versus late. And for males, early puberty means that they get bigger and stronger, and that tends to be things that their peers find really impressive. So tends to be more positive overall. Their friends look up to them. They're sort of more likely to be positively regarded by those around them. The difference comes in when we look at females who mature early. This can actually have some very negative effects for them. So this early maturation can actually lead to them having very negative self-image because those changes and those hormones swinging and the effects on their bodies overall, they typically end up gaining weight. And that awkward transition period can make them feel extra self-conscious. And we'll actually see that the way that their brains work at the time, they feel like they're being watched and judged a lot more than they really are. So a lot of these internal components make them feel very uncomfortable. And that self-consciousness can lead to negative behaviors, things like eating disorders or problems with school or even heightened levels of anxiety overall. So for the most part, the experience tends to be positive for males and fairly negative for females if they end up being hitting that maturity before others of their age. They'll also feel sort of singled out because they're different from everyone else. And if we look at late maturation, that can be problematic on both sides because once again, they'd feel that they are different from everyone around them, and that can make them feel extra self-conscious too. And again, we'll look at some thought patterns in a few slides that help explain why. But if we look at our brains by this stage, our brains have basically matured. We're almost at full adult size, full adult density, things like that. But there are still differences in activation, and there are still going to be more connections formed, of course, because we're having more and more experiences as we get older. So the growth overall has slowed down, where there's very little change in terms of size and number of cells from here onward. But activation changes, connections change. And in fact, if we look at functional MRI, looking at different parts of the brain, they'll find that children have their own distinct patterns, adolescents have their own distinct patterns, and adults have their own distinct patterns. Because once again, our brains are not fully formed, not fully mature until at least mid-20s. So there are definitely differences in terms of those connections. And like I stressed, a lot of these later changes are occurring in the frontal lobes. And those are the areas, again, responsible for impulse control, more abstract reasoning, thinking about consequences of your actions, as well as personality and a whole bunch of other things. So that's an area with lots and lots of associations that pulls a lot of information from other parts of the brain to make these critical determinations. If we look at the non-myelinated gray matter versus our white matter, which is myelinated. So if we've talked about sort of the white matter and gray matter within our brains, we're talking about cell bodies, which are always unmyelinated, being our gray matter, and then our white matter being those myelinated axons. And the axons are how we make connections with other parts of the brain. So we see that with that white matter, it's going to keep increasing and it ends up being sort of peaking in adulthood. So that's why we know that those developmental things in the frontal cortex are coming much later into adolescence and adulthood. But the non-myelinated component, all of those cell bodies, that peaks towards the end of childhood. And the reason here is because we typically don't see a lot of neurogenesis is the word I'm thinking of. We don't have a lot of new neurons being formed, so the cell bodies don't really change, but the connections are what changes as we get older, once we're out of childhood. So that's why we're leaning into this idea that all those changes, all those connections are what are peaking within this period of time in our frontal cortex. In other parts of the brains, we don't see as clear cut of a pattern because there is a lot of connections in those areas because of that pattern we talked about before, where we start with essential areas and then finish with the association areas. That's why this pattern holds here too. And so, like I said before, a lot of this process as we're getting older is getting more specific. That pruning of unnecessary cells is coming about because our experiences lead to certain connections being strengthened and adding new connections where we don't have any, but also getting rid of redundant connections, things that we don't need, things that are duplicates. All of that gets gone. And so this process is showing that changing as we get more experiences as we get older. So all of that pruning, I guess you can specifically say on the slide here, it's allowing for more efficient communication between areas because we've gotten rid of the excess. We've gotten rid of what isn't necessary. And one of those areas that we see massive changes is actually in our corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is the bridge between our two hemispheres. So if we need to share information from one side of the brain to the other, there's only one place that that crossover can happen. And because there's so much integration of information from both sides, we end up seeing this 10% increase in those connections across that one bridge. So this is a massive amount of increase in that area as compared to other parts of the brain. Now, this next section here, so you've probably heard, it's very commonly discussed in media, that because that prefrontal cortex, that area in our frontal lobe that allows us to evaluate consequences of our actions and inhibit behaviors that maybe would have negative consequences, because that doesn't fully develop until our mid-20s, that's why adolescents are so risky in their behaviors, why they act in certain ways without any thought for consequence, because they can't do it at all. However, while yes, we do see that adolescents are more likely to engage in these risk-taking behaviors and not thinking of the consequences of their actions, it isn't only because of this later development of their prefrontal cortex. It definitely plays a role, and it is true that it's developing later on. However, other factors, things like peer groups and expectations of others and things like that, especially starting to experience freedom for the first time, can absolutely affect this as well. So yes, that late prefrontal cortex development is a thing and correlates with those behaviors. We have to consider other factors as well, as per always. And this slide here is where we can talk about those ways of thinking that I mentioned before, things that can make individuals feel, say, the center of attention. So we're getting into egocentrism once again, sort of that focus on the self and being concerned about how others are viewing you and how things affect you. But we have two concepts here. So the overestimation of our unique experiences or feelings is called the personal fable. So a lot of adolescents think that their experiences are special to them. So nobody else has ever fallen in love with this person so hard, or my life is so different from everyone else's. We also have this oversensitivity to social evaluation, and they call that one the imaginary audience. So the idea that everybody is looking at me, everyone is judging me, everyone is going to think poorly of me. So we can see why those would absolutely affect self-image as you're developing. It also kind of makes sense if we look at movies that are, say, designed for teens, or books, basically any kind of media. And in those situations, they like stories that make you feel special, where the main character is unique and important, someone who's worthy of keeping everyone's attention. And that can, these can kind of explain why that might be so appealing. And in fact, this egocentrism, this self focus, can actually be part of that engagement in risky behaviors because they feel special and unique, and possibly leading them to feel invulnerable or exempt from certain consequences. So there's lots of these factors that can absolutely be tied back to that idea. But this has us back on that cognitive development track that we had left off looking at with children, and we should be unsurprised that we're seeing that increase in our abstract reasoning abilities. If you remember, when we talked about Piaget, we said that the final step that we talked about there was technically adolescence. So that formal operational stage is that abstract reasoning. So it gets to come back here once again. So yeah, abstract reasoning is our critical point here. And we also have more flexible and more creative thinking because of that, where they can think of possibilities that they might not have encountered before. They can imagine scenarios that they might not have observed. And so once they hit that formal operational thought stage, they can start using deductive reasoning in order to solve their problems systematically. So try this. If it doesn't work, we can eliminate it. Try that. And if that doesn't work, we eliminate that and try something else. And so this is why we're seeing here that idea of being scientifically minded. And so this actually, this example here was looking at how children might be able to solve a problem looking at pendulums and sort of the different lengths of string and how far it would have to swing. And I think it was one of those, like, you want it to release at a certain point and then fly a certain distance. And you have a bunch of different weights and a bunch of string lengths, and they get to trial and error sort of the optimal solution for the problem. We don't need the specifics of that, but there's all sorts of these types of tasks where they give you a bunch of variables, a bunch of things you can manipulate, and they look at the process that you use. And often we end up seeing that they'll follow a very structured way of trying all of the possibilities. This next slide is looking at identity development. And this one kind of hasn't connected to anything else, so we're just talking about it here before we move on towards that transitioning to adulthood. But I suppose we can connect it in that having an identity, having this knowledge of who you are and what you are and how you fit into society is definitely important for that transition into becoming a fully functioning adult. But with this theory here, this was originally proposed by James Marcia in the 1980s, and they thought that we'd have these 4 different statuses, and it's all based on exploration and commitment. So exploration is, have you looked into all of the possibilities? Have you tried thinking about all of these different ways that you can be or who you can be? We then also have our commitment, and this is, are you set on your identity or are you willing to keep changing? And so all of these combinations, we can have individuals who they maybe have a foreclosed identity. So in this case, they would have prematurely decided who they are because they didn't really look around to see if their decision is the best for them. So this could be somebody who has gone with whatever default identity they were given, maybe by their parents. They become who their parents expected them to be, or they've become whatever was expected of them in high school or something like that. So they didn't do a ton of exploration, and they've settled, they've committed to that identity without looking into other options. We can have this identity diffusion period where you haven't made any decisions, but you also haven't looked into possibilities. So maybe you're not ready to settle on an identity because you haven't looked into things. We can run into this psychosocial moratorium, which is their fancy way of saying that people are in that exploration process. They haven't committed to anything. What they're doing right now is looking at their possibilities, trying out different identities before they settle. So this is that exploration and growth period where they figure out what works. So this could be things like going to university or college, trying different classes, maybe going to different jobs and seeing if you like this job or if you should try something else. So lots of that exploration. And then the last, and this was Marcia's sort of goal in mind, where people should strive to end up, is identity achievement, where you've settled after that high level of exploration. You looked into it, you found who you are, what your best decision is, and that's where you've settled. You now have your identity. And so here we're getting into that transition out of adolescence and into adulthood. And like I had said before, this process can change dramatically depending on culture. But marriage is typically one of those transition points, and that changes as time goes on as well. But we might look at things like, say, being able to support yourself. So living on your own, being independent, financially independent and physically independent, that might be the transition from childhood to adulthood or adolescence to adulthood. But again, we're going to see that a lot of this varies depending on cultures and societies and values. And it can change between individuals as well, not just between cultures. And while I have listed Erickson's stages here, I have an entire diagram and a few slides where we can talk about them all together. So I'm going to skip them here and do that then. So yeah, let's hop right into adulthood, where we can look at what happens as we hit that sort of, we are matured, we are independent, we are now officially adults. What does that mean? So a lot of this is going to focus on changes as we go from sort of the stability and consistency of early adulthood into older age. So things like, say, a gradual decline in things like fluid intelligence. We've mentioned this before in the intelligence chapter, where as we get older, our ability to think quickly tends to decrease. And so we're able to think less creatively. It takes a little bit longer to come up with solutions, and we often don't have creative solutions. But we do see some compensation because other skills may be stable or even increase. So things like crystallized intelligence, that experience as we get older and older and experience and encounter more things, we have more memories to pull on to help us move on into adulthood or move on into problem solving, even without that flexible thinking. We also start to compensate for some detriments or some changes over time. I always use the example of I am a very forgetful person. However, I've learned that maybe I could tie it to the next point, technology. I set a lot of alarms. I remind myself where I need to be and when. I leave notes. So I've learned that here's something I struggle with. Here's how I can fix that. And as we get older, we learn what works really well for us. And often when we start seeing declines, we can do things to help fix that. This point here should actually be its own point, but we do see correlations between having less mind wandering and more heightened cognitive abilities. It was framed here as sort of keeping control of your mind leads to cognitive benefits. But in a lot of cases, it might just be that having sort of better cognitive abilities might allow you to focus better. Or it could be a learned skill, something that you get better with time, especially once you figure it out and start compensating for the way that your mind works. You might now have tricks to help you stay focused. So for myself, if I'm doing a very simple task, I love listening to music because it keeps me focused, keeps me from getting bored, keeps my mind from wandering, and allows me to work for much longer than I would have without extra stimulation. Now, while we do say that our fluid intelligence decreases with age and crystallized intelligence increases with age, we should make it clear that not all studies agree on this, and not all studies see as consistent a pattern. And a lot of it comes from how are these things being measured. So this is one study where they actually looked at a cross-sectional data sample versus a longitudinal data sample. And they use the same types of tests: verbal ability, spatial orientation, and inductive reasoning, where the red and green are fluid intelligence indicators, and the blue is a crystallized intelligence indicator, where in cross-sectional data they saw clear difference between the two for patterns, but their longitudinal data kind of threw that out the window. And so this could be an issue with samples. This could be an issue with generations or cohorts, where different cohorts would have had different experiences. So you always want to kind of look at this and be critical when we're thinking about it. So this is that combination of, hey, remember when we talked about these types of studies and our potential concerns, looking at data from those studies, but also acknowledging that some of the patterns that we're fairly sure occur are not always as clearly supported as we might like. That being said, we do actually see a lot of loss of brain tissue as we get older. So typically by about 90, we end up losing 5 to 10% of our brain mass by weight. And a lot of this loss happens in the frontal and parietal lobes, which, with our frontal lobe being so essential for that critical thinking, for impulse control, for things like that, that can definitely be important, and could lead to that decline in cognitive ability. One thing to note, though, here is that there are a lot of effects of things like your lifestyle, your nutrition, and even things like your attitude towards aging. But in this case, I guess, but a decade ago, maybe 2 decades ago, they started to have this massive push to look at what was going on within old age homes, and why you'd have all of these individuals who were fairly cognitively sound. They were doing really well on their own, but maybe they had to go into a care facility because of injury or something like that. And a lot of people reported that they were noticing really rapid declines after they entered these facilities. And a lot of it comes back to the fact that when they're in their own homes, when they have that freedom and are able to interact with others regularly, it's a very enriching environment. They have lots to do, lots to keep their minds occupied. And as we often see, maintaining that sort of thought process, using those skills, lets you keep them for longer. More of that, if you don't use it, you lose it ideation. And so in homes that had less activities, less stimulation, they saw faster decline. So there were lots of studies that looked at things like, well, what if we get them to play video games? They might not be able to physically move around a lot and go on adventures outside, but let's get them playing video games. Let's get them solving puzzles. And things like that actually end up counteracting a lot of this loss of tissue. And it ends up correcting for a lot of that loss of cognitive functioning. So there are ways to offset this for sure. I actually want to come back to this slide in a minute and look at this one here, because we've been talking about that change in information processing, where we do see that our perceptual speed slows down. We also start finding it a little bit harder to make new connections, to form new memories. Spatial recall, if you forget where you've placed that item, and more absent-mindedness tends to come with age. And eventually overall recall can be a little bit harder, especially in individuals with more of that loss, because a lot of that loss isn't just you're losing entire neurons, but sometimes it's just loss of connections. There are a bunch of studies that have looked at changes in our prospective memory, and this is just our memory to do something in the future. And this is an interesting topic because it is memory in that we have to remember something, but it's a forward acting memory. So not only do we need to remember that there's something we need to do, but we also need, in the moment where it's important, to have that awareness to recall that that's something that needs to happen at this moment in time. So there are some studies that have shown that our prospective memory decreases with age, but it's actually really hard to determine if that's the case or not. especially if we get back to that idea of compensation, because you find skills and strategies that can completely counteract any declines. So overall, we do see sort of this loss across the board, but it's not always as intense. And like we said, it can be counteracted depending on your environment. So back to this point here, though, I did mention that there was a potential fifth stage from like Piaget's cognitive stage theory. And this is our post-formal operational thinking. So this is our last stage. And what we're getting into here is the fact that not only are we in that sort of abstract reasoning is no problem for us, however, this is a lot of sort of abstract reasoning, but external from the self. So this one focuses a lot on the fact that we can acknowledge that I have certain ideas, certain standards or beliefs or whatever, and that other people can have their own beliefs and standards and things like that. And we could logically reason that both of us might think that our perspective is correct. So we can reason logically about these opposing points of view, and we can accept those contrast. We can accept that, well, I might not agree with that person's way of thinking, but they are entitled to their own perspective. They are entitled to their way of thinking. So we can accept these contradictions. We can accept these irreconcilable differences that we will never come to agree, but we can tolerate each other. We can come to terms with that and move on. So this might be, as you get older, you have certain relatives and you can just tolerate the fact that, you know, they have opinions you don't agree with. But if we both agree not to talk about it, we can tolerate each other's existence into the future. This also ties to things like I can acknowledge that there are certain arguments or certain points that might make another one of those perspectives appealing to others. This could be like if you went into a debate and were asked to argue for or against something, even if you only agree with the for side, you could come up with arguments to make a compelling explanation, argument again. You could make up a good argument as part of your debate to go with something you don't believe in, because you're capable of that flexibility in thinking and in reasoning. I have also noticed on the slide, this should not say fourth, it should say fifth, but I just figured I'd point that out here. And then this slide here is about sort of intense decline or intense degradation of our brain matter. So things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease actually being sort of the most common and the most sort of impactful form of dementia. But both are going to cause deterioration of brain functioning, usually because of some underlying neural deterioration as well. You can also see things like Parkinson's disease can lead to dementia as well. It all depends about the sort of modality of it. What is it affecting? And of course, what are some of the side effects based on which areas are targeted? With Alzheimer's disease, we end up seeing a lot of problems in our temporal lobes, and the degradation ends up progressing not just from the surface, but deeper into some of those subcortical structures, meaning that it can cause problems with memory. And we have language areas in our temporal lobe and nearby, so that can cause problems. And overall cognitive functioning can absolutely be affected, because as the disorder progresses, it moves into our frontal lobes as well, until eventually pretty much every part of the brain can be impacted in one way, shape, or form. But when we look at all of the different types of dementia, we become more susceptible to these as we get older, sometimes because that natural degeneration is just gets extreme in certain cases. With more of those, hey, we talked about this concept earlier type discussions, getting into attachment styles. And I had hinted that our infant attachment styles actually carry forward into older age. And so two researchers, Hazen and Shaver, in again the 1980s, figured out that, hey, the way that children attach as children seems to be consistent with how they often attach as adults. Now, it isn't guaranteed that your childhood attachment style is for sure going to be your adult adult attachment style. However, there is a strong correlation between the two. And so, just like before with our securely attached infants, secure or autonomous attachment adults are typically going to be the most common, but also those who have the most sort of adaptive or stable attachments and relationships with others. So they can be independent, they are capable of being happy on their own, but they can also appreciate and enjoy emotional closeness. So they can be with other people or on their own and would be equally confident in those cases. Our anxious or preoccupied adults, those are the ones who come from that insecure resistant attachment style from infants. And so here, they're typically very uncomfortable with independence. So they tend to over-attach to others in their relationships. They'd be especially anxious because they're worried that the partners in their lives or other people they interact with might leave them, and they don't want to be alone. Our dismissive or avoidant attachment styles, those come from our other, or the last of our childhood attachment styles. And these individuals are really going to try and stay independent, and they're going to avoid relationships as much as they can. They learned in childhood that they can't rely on others, and that's led them as adults to not want to rely on others. We mentioned some of our milestones where marriage might be one of those transition points, but in cultures where it isn't the marker of adulthood, it can also be a component of adulthood. And again, these vary dramatically between different cultures, but they also change over time, where a lot of these have become maybe not as expected, not as sort of ingrained as they would have been in previous generations. So it used to be that you got married, you moved into a house together, you had children, you retired at a certain age, and that was what was anticipated for your lives. And nowadays, some people might choose to have children but not get married, or get married and not have children. They might work for longer or for less time than before was anticipated. They might buy a house or not buy a house. And all of these things change depending on what is normal within that society at that time. It used to be that, if you went outside of that preconceived notion of these are the orders, these are the time periods where this is acceptable, it's now become a lot more widely accepted that different people are going to choose to do these things or not do these things on very different timescales. So those cultural norms absolutely change and evolve as time goes on. And for some of these points, so marriage as a milestone, if it is a good marriage, if it is a happy marriage, so when people indicate that they are satisfied and content with those relationships, they tend to also correlate with good health and long-term well-being, can even lead to longer lives. But again, correlational. But those in unhappy marriages might actually see the opposite. So poor quality marriages lead them to being unhappy, leads to higher rates of divorce, and can also correlate with lower health and well-being indicators. For parenthood, this is something that can also have a pretty dramatic effect on marriage and the status of that marriage, happy or unhappy. And it's often because it's a period of transition and change. It's also a period of really high stress because you went from sort of two individuals on their own and only focusing on each other to having to now keep another individual alive. And it can cause tension within the marriage. But in the long run, as long as they sort of get through that transition period, it can be related to positive emotions. And a lot of individuals indicate that it helps them have meaning in their lives or feel like they've accomplished something in their lives. Retirement is something we're going to talk about again later on because different individuals will have very different perspectives of retirement. So it's it can be influenced by things like financial resources. So if you have lots of money saved up, going into retirement is not stressful, and it can happen earlier. Whereas if you have reduced resources, it could mean that your quality of life is going to dramatically decrease when you stop working. We can also look at things like whether you choose to retire or are forced to retire. That plays a huge role as well, where choosing to retire tends to frame it as a positive thing, and being forced to retire makes it a lot worse, a lot more negative. Um, we also mentioned that importance of maintaining an active lifestyle after retirement, because once you leave the workplace, we tend to see a reduction in the complexity of your environment. You're not forced out of the house every day. You're not interacting with multiple people. You're not necessarily solving problems to the same degree that you would in a workplace. And that loss of stimulation can actually end up leading to that cognitive decline we were talking about a few slides back. There are tons and tons of theories on sort of how we look at things as we get older, especially getting into old age and towards end of life. But this is one of those interesting ones I like to talk about. So this is our socio-emotional selectivity theory. And this is just a really broad theory that focuses on our perception of time and how that changes our priorities over time. So this says that younger individuals would favor information-related goals. So I want to learn this thing. I want to experience that. And the idea being that when you're younger, acquiring all of these skills, this information that can help you as you get older, you have more time to make use of those skills. So it's a good investment. Whereas once we get older, we favor a lot more emotion-related goals. Things like focusing on our relationships or being comfortable in our own lives, making ourselves happy. So information gathering is a lot less important, especially if you don't have as long to be using it. So I'd rather be happy towards the end of my life than focus on advancing and things like that. This can also tie to the fact that as people get older, they actually end up having smaller and smaller friend groups. And sort of a really dark way to talk about it is, yes, they are probably having people in their friend group die, so there are fewer to interact with, but we actually also see a lot of pruning where they get rid of negative relationships. They avoid people that don't make them happy, because why bother making other people happy when I could just focus on my own well-being? So they become more critical of those they give their time to and the events that they spend their time on, because it's now a limited resource. This is that diagram I promised we'd talk about, looking at Erikson's stages of development. And Erikson's research is kind of interesting because we set up all of these conflict points. So these are labeled here as developmental milestones, but it's basically a moment where we have two possible outcomes here: trust versus mistrust. And if you reach that milestone, if you find that sort of positive component, you have sort of benefits that come from that. And if you don't, then there are negatives that come from that. And so I'm only going to look at a couple of these because you can read them all on the slide here. But if we look at trust versus mistrust in infancy, children either learn to trust their caretakers and therefore trust relationships moving into the future and trust their environment, or they develop mistrust, where maybe they start relying on themselves. So we can tie this into some of our attachment theory stuff as well. Autonomy versus shame and doubt into that early childhood. So if you have the autonomy side of things, you become sort of confident in your own ability. I feel autonomous. I can make my own decisions. My say matters. Whereas if you get the shame and doubt, then children are reluctant to trust their own decisions. They might feel like they have to rely on others and maybe don't trust their own ability to make those correct decisions, and they would stop trying to do so, and so on and so forth. But the one I wanted to look at here is towards the end, looking at this ego integrity versus despair into that old age, where if you have that integrity, you're getting to the end of your life and you feel like you have lived a successful and full and rewarding life. And if not, you might come to the end of your life and feel like you had missed opportunities or you should have done something different. And that can lead to those feelings of despair and depression and hopelessness, which can make it really hard to sort of accept that your life is close to ending. We did mention retirement as being something important in terms of that sort of later stages of life. But if we wanted to talk about careers overall, there are, of course, theories on that as well, where when it comes to careers, we typically see this basic pattern. We don't have ages or dates or anything established here because there's a lot of variation, but typically you have a growth stage. What is it that you want to do? What do you like? What do you dislike? Can you start thinking about where you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years? That leads to our exploration stage, where you have some ideas about what you might like, things that you might want to pursue. So you can seek out an education, you can get training. This is great for something like co-op. I've mentioned before, I did co-op and tried a bunch of jobs and found what I did like, which was birds, and what I didn't like, which was office work. And so this can be really useful in determining what path is it that you want to take moving forward. Once you've found an area you like, you get into establishment. So find a place to work, get good at it, start making your mark. Once you have sort of inserted yourself into that workplace, once you have your skills, once you're comfortable, you maintain that career. You maybe stop striving to get promoted. You might find a place where you're happy. So you're just in holding pattern. And then as you get older, towards retirement age, we end up in a decline stage. So maybe you stop caring as much. I'm only 5 years from retirement. I don't need to try as hard. My evaluations don't matter as much. Those sorts of things. So your investment in work decreases, probably because you're starting to focus on, going back here, things that make you happy or feel accomplished or good or something like that. We should absolutely acknowledge that people can go from, say, the establishment phase or maintenance phase and decide they want to change. Maybe they go back to the beginning and change their careers, things like that. We also see that women often don't follow this path, especially because of the undue or disproportionate reliance on women to take on, say, family responsibilities or maintaining homes or caretaker roles and things like that. So they might not progress through this pattern, or there might be long pauses as they do things like, say, have children and raise them before returning to the workforce. So there are always exceptions to these stages. Oop, wrong way. Next, brief discussion about midlife crises, because there's always that talk of people hit 40 or 45 and they start to have this crisis of identity where they worry that maybe they've missed out on parts of life, or they start to panic that their lives are half over. And while the media does absolutely portray this sort of extreme version of a midlife crisis where people suddenly quit their jobs or go out and buy really expensive sports cars or start sleeping around because they can. However, when we look at it, happiness and life satisfaction tend to be fairly consistent throughout adulthood. We don't see this massive decline where people start panicking about what their life is and what it means when they hit 40. So a full-blown midlife crisis appears to be a myth. Though there are some studies that see that there's sort of this period of turbulence around 40 to 45 where people become sort of acutely aware of their mortality. And a lot of that ties down to the fact that they're starting to realize that some of their goals, some of their dreams might not be attainable, and they have to come to terms with that. However, it's nowhere near as extreme or as consistent as the midlife crisis myth might have appeared, especially from media portrayals. Retirement is next, and I've already kind of talked about a bunch of this, even though I didn't mean to. But our adjustment to retirement definitely is influenced by a bunch of factors. I talked about the fact that whether it's willing or not, what your financial situation is, can you support yourself or not? Those are really important. Things like, do you have a spouse, and is that spouse retired too? So if not, then you might be spending an awful lot of time alone, which can lead to dissatisfaction and having trouble adjusting to that process. It also depends on your career and how you felt about your career. Some people, their career was their identity. They were whatever their role was. And losing that can mean that they really miss that role. They really miss that certainty. Even something like the routine. Some people might hate leaving that routine. Some people, though, are going to frame it more positively. They look forward to the leisure. They look forward to all the things they couldn't do while they were working. So it's sort of it's either very positive or very negative, just depending on all of these other factors. And of course, as we're getting towards the end here, we can talk about death and dying, where again, we see that individuals can approach end of life in very, very different ways. So some people are okay with it. Some people don't dread the end. They might look back on their lives and be very satisfied. But others might look at it as something scary, something unknown, something they really don't want to think about. So there's all sorts of differences there. And it, of course, can be affected by beliefs and customs. Some people, if they believe in an afterlife, they can be more accepting of the end. And interestingly, when we look at people nearing the end of their lives, those individuals who are older typically have a more positive approach than, say, younger relatives, because they can look at it and say, well, I've lived a really full life. I have this satisfaction, all of these accomplishments that I've achieved. I'm ready. But others in their family or in their friend group might not be ready to see them go. So there's all sorts of different perspectives to consider. And if you're curious why we have this random individual on the slide, this is Jeanne-Louise Calment, who is the sort of oldest or the longest lived individual that they've been able to verify. And she died at the age of 120. So she lived from 1875 to 1997, which is a very long span of time. And you don't need to know anything about her. I just thought it was interesting to include her as that longest verified living individual across her lifespan. And then our last slide here is our 5 stages of dying. And this might be familiar because these 5 stages have been used in a bunch of ways with a bunch of different things. But with death and dying, they were proposed as denial. You can't accept that it's going to happen. You get anger where you're mad that this is happening to you, that reaching that stage of bargaining. Well, I will do this to change so that it doesn't happen. People might go back to religion or something, sort of this promise of, I will live a better life if that doesn't have to happen. And once people come to terms with the fact that there's nothing they can do to change it, they might hit depression. So they're really upset. They can't believe it's still happening, but they know that it is going to happen, and they don't know what to do with themselves because of that. And then eventually they would move on to acceptance of none of the other things happened. It's going to happen, and I guess I have to be okay with that. But yeah, that's where these were originally proposed as Kubler-Ross's stages of dying.